We ranked all of the most jacked Baki characters from a bodybuilding perspective, and we had several that had perfect bodybuilding physiques. And in our tier ranking system, that puts them at the Mr. Olympia level. In today's video, we're gonna be taking those 4 characters that made it all the way to the top and actually putting them side by side and determining who has the best physique of them all. Alright, so we have these 4 characters. We have Kaku Kayu, Yuichiro Hanma, Biscuit Oliva, and Yujiro Hanma. All of these characters would be Mr. Olympia tier bodybuilders. So let's start by kind of looking at the stats that we have on each one of these characters. Up first, Kaku Kayu. We don't really have his stats as far as I'm aware as to how big he was in his youth. It's listed in fandom that he's 5'1", 88 pounds. Obviously, this guy's not 88 pounds, but let's say maybe, you know, he's older now, so he's probably shrunk a little bit. Let's say he was like more like 5'4", 5'5", and probably like at least 100 pounds more than he is now, but he looks like he could be even more than that. If he's 5'4", 5'5", I would say he's probably coming in around 200 or something like that. So next we have Yuichiro. Also, I'm not sure if I'm actually saying that right or not. That's just how I say it. Let me know in the comments just how wrong I'm getting that name. All right, so Fandom doesn't have a weight listed for Yuichiro. They have him at 5'11" though, so he's significantly taller than Kaku. And looking like he does here, he kind of reminds me of someone like Big Ramy or even someone like Ronnie Coleman. He's absolutely massive, so I would say he's probably around the 300 mark. Next up, we have Biscuit Oliva, and we are lucky enough to have his stats. He is also 5'11", and he comes in at 330 pounds. So this actually really tracks with what I thought Yuichiro might be. Maybe even knowing this, I would place Yuichiro a little bit higher and put him around 330 as well, because they're a very similar amount of muscle mass. And then finally, we have Yujiro Hanma. He's the tallest of them all. He comes in at 6'3" and weighs about 265 pounds, which makes sense because I've always said that he has a more lean physique, and I would place him maybe even in the classic physique division. It would be tough because he has such an aesthetic physique, especially compared to some of these other guys. Although having said that, I've got to be honest, all of these characters have a really aesthetic physique. He just has a crazier V-taper shape to his physique. So now I have the best versions of each of these characters that I know of pulled up right here. Let's start with muscle mass overall. So if you'll remember, there are 4 different criteria in bodybuilding. We have muscle mass, symmetry, proportions, and conditioning. Let's go over each one of those with each of these characters, and we'll start with muscle mass. So honestly, all of these characters have pretty much a 10 out of 10 muscle mass, but in this ranking, I'm gonna be really picky because they all have like 10 out of 10 everything and are Mr. Olympias, obviously, but when comparing them to one another, we have to really look at the fine details. Kaku Kayu obviously has a smaller frame than the rest of these guys, but he definitely maxes it out. I actually don't see a place where he could add any muscle mass except maybe his arms. That's the only thing about this shot is like his bis and tris look a little bit funky, and we'll get to that more in the proportions section, but he's definitely maxed out his frame there. I mean, look at those calves. I mean, his calves are actually probably bigger than his quads, which is insane. And then you have Yuichiro Hanma. I also think he's maxed out his frame, and this is the best shot that I know of him. I know there are more updated shots, but this one to me, even though he's a ghost, he has the best conditioning and all that sort of stuff, so it's kind of like cheating. But if we take the other version of him, the other shot of him, his conditioning doesn't look quite as nice, so this is the best version I could find of him. And in this version, he has also maxed out his frame, and I think his arms look really good. His biceps look great, his triceps look great. All the proportions are right on point. Up next, we have Biscuit Oliva, who I never thought I would say, but looks a little bit smaller when compared to Yuichiro. Now, if he's listed at 330 pounds, I would almost want to make Yuichiro just a little bit more, like 340 pounds or so, because it said they're the same height. And he definitely has just a little bit more muscle mass, at least in this form. This is more of his real life form, and obviously he is like a 10 out of 10 here as well, but he's just a little bit less conditioned than in something like this, but he's still got a crazy amount of muscle mass. Yeah, so Biscuit Oliva, to me, if he's the same height, is just a little bit smaller muscle mass wise. Now, at the Mr. Olympia stage, you don't have to be the biggest guy on stage, right? There are other factors involved in picking the actual Mr. Olympia and who wins and who doesn't win. But in terms of size, well, let's go over Yujiro. Yujiro is clearly the smallest out of all of these guys in terms of maxing out his frame, and which is crazy to say because it still looks maxed out as well. It's a bit of an anomaly. Like, his shoulders are not gonna get any bigger than this. His shoulders, he's probably got the best shoulders out of all of these guys here. His arms are a little bit wacky, kind of like Kaku's, and he's got the best V-taper. Like I said, this guy could definitely be in classic physique as well, but with some parts of his physique, he's actually bigger than some of these other guys. Like, look at the chest. I think he might have one of the best chests, and then his lats really pop out really well. and he obviously has the best V-taper. But in terms of overall muscle mass, I've got to give the win to Yuichiro Hanma. All right, up next we have symmetry. This one is a tough one because they're drawn characters, so they're gonna look the same on each side. They're gonna have that kind of X shape to their physique. Almost everyone always gets a 10 out of 10 on these. I'm trying to be really picky. Like Biscuit Oliva's arms look a little bit weird right here, like they don't really match, but I guess you could say the same thing for some of these other characters. So who has the best overall symmetry? It's pretty close. I'd have to give it to one of the Hanmas here. Let's just say it's a tie between the Hanmas. So yeah, so symmetry overall, I have to give to the Hanmas. All right, so moving on from there, we have proportions. Now, like I said earlier, Kaku's proportions are really, really good overall, but compared to these guys, there's a few things that are a little bit off. So like his biceps, his triceps don't really match his shoulders. They're a little bit smaller, and they don't really match his forearms either. They're pretty small too. They're pretty small in comparison to his forearms. Then moving on to Yuichiro, in this shot right here, I don't see anything that really looks out of whack with his proportions. Everything looks pretty much spot on. I mean, you could maybe say the same thing about the calves right here as compared to his quads, but we just don't see his quads. And same thing if we go to his human form as well. There's not a lot that we can say. Maybe in his human form, his chest looks a little bit smaller, like compared to his shoulders. And in the ghost form, like his chest looks absolutely massive and it matches his shoulders really well. But overall, pretty darn good proportions. Then with Biscuit Oliva, I mean, his calf to quad proportions are pretty much spot on. This is almost a perfect proportioned body right here for bodybuilding. Yeah, I mean, I just don't think it gets any better proportions wise, and that goes across the board for all of his shots too. I mean, he was modeled after Sergio Oliva, who had some of the best proportions in all of bodybuilding history, so that absolutely makes sense. And then if we come to Yujiro Hanma, he's got some pretty crazy proportions depending on the shot that we're looking at. I do think like his forearms look crazy compared to like his bis and tris, so he's kind of got that Kaku Kayu like arm going on. His delts are like absolutely massive, but they overpower his bis and tris. So I think in order, I would probably put Kaku at the end, then Yujiro, and then in first place, it's got to be between these two guys. I think I'm going to give Biscuit Oliva the victory on proportions, with Yuichiro coming in a close second. All right, so before we get into conditioning, if you're enjoying this video, which I assume you are because you've made it this far, feel free to like and subscribe as it really helps out the channel. So conditioning is really about how lean the physique is. Can we see the muscular feathering? Can we see the vascularity? Can we see all of the muscle separations as well? In my opinion, Kaku Kayu destroys this. He has crazy feathering, he has crazy vascularity. Yuichiro probably comes in last on this one. I mean, especially in his human form, but even in his ghostly form, like we can see some really good muscular feathering, but obviously I don't know if ghosts have veins, but if they do, he's missing them. He's pretty good in his ghostly form. I would say he's probably still in last compared to these other guys, because then we go to Biscuit Oliva and we look at some of his human form. Of course he's got human form. He's only a human. We see some of these shots where he's just absolutely crazy veiny and has crazy muscular separation, especially in the quads, in the chest, and all of these muscles. And then Yujiro has crazy separation as well. I think some of these shots are lacking some of the vascularity needed for the top level of bodybuilding. So in order, I give Kaku the victory in conditioning, followed by Biscuit Oliva, followed by Yujiro, and then lastly Yuichiro. So let's do a quick recap. Muscularity goes to Yuichiro, symmetry goes to Yuichiro, proportions goes to Biscuit Oliva, and conditioning goes to Kaku. So it's a really tight race between these three especially. Now Yujiro has an amazing physique and could definitely win Mr. Olympia if he were going against anyone else pretty much ever. But out of these three, this is tough. So I think in order, I'm gonna give fourth place to either Kaku or Yujiro. I think I'm gonna go with Yujiro because Kaku's just so well conditioned. He has such great striations and vascularity. So I'm gonna go fourth place is Yujiro. Third place is Kaku Kayu. Second place has got to be Yuichiro Hanma. And number one, the best anime physique in terms of bodybuilding in all of the Baki universe is the one and only Biscuit Oliva. I just think his proportions and his conditioning are so spot on. I do think Yuichiro has a little bit more muscle mass overall, and Yuichiro has basically a perfect physique for open bodybuilding. The proportions are really, really good. But in terms of conditioning, in terms of overall shape, and in terms of posing, Biscuit Oliva wins. Who would you give the victory to? Let me know in the comments below.